Hello, fellow travelers, and welcome to the Versus Stars podcast, third season. How my loyal listeners, thank you for your continued support. And remember, click the subscribe button, everybody. This is an amazing episode because Aaron Waltke boards the mothership. He's a producer, executive producer, and writer of Star Trek Prodigy. Now, come on board as we go traversing the stars. Hi, Aaron. Thank you so much for coming to the Versus Stars podcast.
Hey, my pleasure. Absolutely. Happy to be here.
It's great. It's definitely an honor to speak with you, sir. So I always start off with the question of inspiration. So what inspired your love for writing and who your earliest influence is?
Oh, interesting. Well, I mean, it's hard to say who my inspiration for writing was because, I think I was always a bit obsessed with all kinds of sort of, sci-fi and fantasy and genre fiction. My dad definitely instilled in me a healthy love of that sort of thing from an early age. I think he wanted me to stop reading Goosebumps books, so he thrust The Hobbit into my hands, and
Ooh.
and then somehow transitioned from that to Lord of the Rings and then to Dune. So it was a very quick transition. And then, of course, on the TV side, he and I watched Star Trek together for as long as I can remember. My first show was Star Trek: The Next Generation, which I watched live when it premiered way back in 1987. And then watched TOS, then of course Deep Space Nine, Voyager, and on and on and on. But yeah, I mean, as far as like who influences me, I always love where there's sort of like a bit of cosmic wonder meets, a little bit of sort of mystery or absurdity. On the fantasy side, I love Terry Pratchett and
Hmm.
Douglas Adams on the sci-fi side. But I also really enjoy hard science fiction authors. Like Asimov. I remember devouring his whole iRobot and Foundation and whatnot. And the list goes on and on. It's all great.
So now you're the producer, the executive producer, and a writer on Star Trek Prodigy. Congratulations. That's a hell of a lot of to balance for one person, but good job. So how did you get involved with this project? How was it pitched to you, the idea of it?
Yeah, so my involvement with the project started with the Hagemans, who I had collaborated with them on a series that came out a few years ago that was from Guillermo del Toro called Tales of Arcadia. It
Hmm.
started with Troll Hunters, and then there was Three Below, and then Wizards Tales of Arcadia. It was sort of a science fantasy series that was on Netflix. I think around 80 episodes total, half hour, and it was very Amblin, very sort of 80s movie. It took a lot of inspiration from Goonies and
Hmm.
Gremlins and Close Encounters and just about anything you can imagine. So and that was, believe it or not, my first TV project. Before that, I worked in features, but they brought me on board, and of course, it was a tremendous honor to work with them and Mark Guggenheim and of course Guillermo del Toro. And like eventually, myself and Chad Quant, who was also a writer on season one of Prodigy, were promoted to be showrunners of Tales of Arcadia, and our offices were right next to theirs. While at DreamWorks, and I think they were writing a movie for them at the time, and they kind of popped their head in and like, so you like Star Trek, right? And I was like, yes, I do. And sure enough, I had actually worked in a lot of very subtle references to Star Trek in the Tales of Arcadia series because I knew it forward and backward. And I feel like as far as shared universes go, it was kind of like the original blueprint for that.
Right, right.
They kind of said, "Oh, we had this great meeting with Secret Hideout, where they want to do sort of a young adult type show with the Troll Hunters guys." And I'm like, "Well, I'm a Troll Hunters guy, though." So yeah, they kind of loosely tossed the idea my way. Does that sound right? Like some kids find an abandoned starship, and I was like, that sounds great. Maybe you could add a hologram character. Just very, very. Just I wanted it to succeed because I love Star Trek shows, and sure enough, they happened to pitch it to Secret Hideout and Nickelodeon, and CBS loved it, and it just was one of the fastest, I think, development turnarounds I can think of. And within like a few months, the writers' room was open, and we were off to the races.
Now, what's so cool about Star Trek Prodigy is that it's not only is a great show for people of all ages, but it's sneakily at the beginning seems very unconventional Star Trek. Almost Star Wars-ish. However, as it develops, it becomes the core of what Star Trek is all about and discusses it.
Mhm.
So, how much of a risk did it feel like to just establish it at that beginning before you move into the deeper Star Trek elements?
Yeah, I mean, I think that when anytime you're trying something new, trying to find a way in for a new audience or reinvent a franchise without repeating yourself, I think there's only so many super duper duper Death Stars you can introduce before you start to crave something different. Um, I think you always have to take a bit of a risk, and we had a lot of very long and serious conversations about like what is the Star Trek franchise as it is now? What is the fan base composed of? What are they sort of expecting? How can we surprise them in a way that also feels organic? And there's a few elements that we really wanted to tackle. One of which was there had never been a show that started outside the Federation before. The closest we got, which I would argue was the most experimental Star Trek prior to this, was Deep Space Nine, which was one of my favorites
Mine too.
of all of Star Trek. And but if you remember when Deep Space Nine first came out, there was a bit of a controversial element to it because the Cisco wasn't a captain yet, and they weren't even on a starship exploring. It was in one fixed space outside of the Bajoran wormhole, and there was a lot of people that were like, "This doesn't feel like Star Trek. It's a little dark and gritty. There's a war brewing." But as the series wears on, you realize that's exactly what afforded it to tell really interesting stories that still fit perfectly within the Star Trek universe, but they just sort of like ran far afield beyond what had been done and planted a flag and said, no, now this is Star Trek too. And that was very exciting for me because as a hardcore Star Trek fan, there were so many things like that I'm sure you had in your experience in the fandom of like there were calls for like why can't there be an all alien crew?
Yep.
Why is it always humans? Why can't the aliens be a little bit more exotic looking rather than just having guys with rubber on their foreheads? And other shows certainly tried that here or there with budget permitting, like Voyager's with species, is it 8472, where very clearly they were kind of pushing at the boundaries of what 90s television could do as far as alien designs. But having an all CGI character back then was unheard of. It would have been the cost of every frame was the cost of a movie or something. But flash forward 15, 20 years to where we are now, the television as an art form has kind of evolved to be a lot more cinematic and capable of taking those bolder swings. And I think there was always going to be a risk of like, will they hang with it and see what the magic trick we were pulling of that sort of sleight of hand, where at first it does feel very remote and starting with characters that know nothing about the Federation or its ideals, and then gradually using that as a platform to inform new and young audiences piece by piece, character arc by character arc, what Star Trek is on a very fundamental level, which is something that I don't think has ever really been done. And that also was very exciting to us because just having those conversations in those early weeks, um, of what is, if you were to explain Star Trek to a complete novice, a tabula rasa, what would be the things you wanted to emphasize, like this is why it's a great show, and also these are the things you need to understand are like what is a phaser and why is it better than a lightsaber, or even like what is the prime directive, or how does a transporter work, and there's all these things that as we kind of dug into it we realized, for instance, the prime directive, which I mentioned, had never been ever outlined in totality on a Star Trek show before ours. Before until now, it was always kind of sort of alluded to or
Hmm.
paraphrased, but no one had ever put the whole thing on screen. And thankfully, another fantastic Star Trek writer, David Goodman, had already written what I feel is the definitive, and now it is the definitive answer of what the Prime Directive is in one of the Star Trek books. So we were able to use that with his permission and codify it into canon. And that was very exciting to us. And I think now that all the first 20 episodes are out, people actually really appreciate that we did it that way, because I hear from people every day, I couldn't get my kid interested in the other Star Treks because it felt like they were playing catch up all the time.
Yep.
But now they finished your season and now they want to go watch Voyager. They want to find out, who that JT Kirk guy was,
And I think that's why I think the show is so brilliant, is that by having hologram Janeway teach the crew about Star Trek and the ideals, you are teaching the audience about those same ideals, and you're not only that, but those same ideals are the ideals you want young audience to learn anyway, and that's a brilliant way to mix all that. Um, so when you were thinking about the ideas of Star Trek, were you thinking that these are also the ideals that young audiences should be learning on television?
Yeah, I think we took that very seriously, and I certainly do with anything that I work on. Is I think theme usually naturally evolves out of character, but at
Hmm.
the end of the day, you do have to pause and think of like, what are we really saying here, you know? And I think when we were kind of reflecting on what can these kids that grew up with nothing really benefit from a utopia in the making like the Federation. And we looked a lot at things like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and can you take someone who was given nothing and effectively build them up so that, like unmolded clay, they could be shaped into their best or at least better selves. And and what does that mean, and what sort of things not only can these kids learn from Starfleet, but what is it that maybe their presence in the Star Trek universe could kind of impart to Starfleet or the Star Trek fandom at large? And I think the thing that we wanted to do on a sort of metatextual level was say, hey, whatever preconceptions you have about who belongs in Starfleet or who doesn't, or what is Star Trek, the very nature of Star Trek begs you to widen that horizon and always be looking out to see who else can you reach a hand out to and hopefully lift them up.
Now, I think another thing that is both brilliant and risky that you did with the show is that you allowed your characters to grow throughout the season. Especially as they're learning the lessons taught by Hologram Janeway, they are developing as individuals, coming of age, things of that nature. A lot of shows, especially sometimes old Star Trek, has a hesitancy to allow the characters to grow. So, was there a discussion, and what was the discussion like about how you're going to let these characters evolve, and how are you being careful not to let them evolve maybe either too far or in a direction where you could continue telling a certain type of story?
Right. Well, I part of that is something that I actually discussed with Brandon Braga recently. And he sort of bemoaned the fact that as nice as it was to work on that era of television, TNG through Voyager, and of course the movies and whatnot. There was a mandate from the studio that said you have to reset everything at
Yep.
the end of the season, and even the slightest scintilla of continuity was sort of would bring the hammer down. But in this day and age, it's just changed, and that was one of the things we discussed, and it's something that we had kind of figured out how to do on Tales of Arcadia, and we're like, let's do it here, like which was don't be afraid of the serialization element, at least coming through in terms of character development, which
Hmm.
is something that I think even Strange New Worlds has kind of embraced, where they have their sort of episodes of the week, but they track an emotional character continuity over the course of the season, and that's something we tried to do too. And I think in this era of television, where you do have people that are binging it, and you have people that watch it week to week, or they watch 3 episodes and forget about it for 2 weeks, or whatever. As long as you're careful to kind of remind people where they are in that journey, you can. The gates are wide open now.
And I think once again, I think one of the favorite parts of the series is hologram Janeway. Obviously audience favorite from Star Trek Voyager. Now, when you were determining to create that character, did Kate Mulgrew had already agreed to be a hologram, and was there a backup plan in case she said, "I'm not doing the character. I don't do cartoons"?
Maybe it was foolhardy, but believe it or not, we did start writing the show without Kate officially saying yes, because she wanted to see before she agreed. Probably rightfully so, to be quite honest, because it's no small ask to
Right.
to say, "Hey, can you reprise this character that was such a huge part of your life?" Um, and so, we moved forward with the full faith and confidence that she would eventually, say yes. That once we had enough scripts and she was able to read them and see what we were doing, and thankfully, she once she read the scripts, she was like, "Okay, I get it. This is fabulous, and I think that the mission statement here is absolutely something that is worth pursuing in Star Trek and in storytelling." But there was a period where we that was not a sure thing, and we did, as far as backup plans go. I think the only one I can think of, the biggest, easiest backup plan was just make it an original character,
Hmm.
which we could have done. I don't know if would have had the same impact, but that was maybe the backup plan as far as the hologram Janeway. As far as the real Janeway, believe it or not, we had independently pitched, what if it was Riker and the Titan instead? And then, and then I think just after we pitched that, Secret Hideout was like, "You should talk to Mike McMahon." Because he had just turned in the season finale where he revealed that Titan and Riker were becoming part of the Lower Decks. So, but those were backup plans, and Janeway was always our first and foremost, and in our minds, only choice. But obviously, as a writer and a producer, especially, you always have to come up with contingencies.
Were there discussions with her, or did she talk with you with any moments of, I don't think Jamie would handle it this way? Because the hologram Jamie, I mean, it's not exactly her, but it kind of is her.
Mhm.
So, what were the discussions like with her about what could or could should not be done in directions for that character?
Yeah, I think the main discussions with her were sort of articulating, the differences between hologram Janeway and the real Janeway, and to her credit, she understood it pretty quickly, and then it was as much up to her to kind of find those interesting nuances. And on top of that, well, spoiler alert: if you haven't watched season one yet, watch all of season one and then replay this podcast. Um, one of the things that we were building towards is that this hollow program was in fact damaged or manipulated by the Vaudecat to be more sort of amenable and pliable to whoever's captaining the ship will help them get back to the Alpha Quadrant. Um, and so I think once she understood that this was sort of like a manipulated program that would be to with perhaps the naivete filters cranked up, at least initially, and then she gradually evolves to sort of regain sentience and self assertion. She found a way to play that very beautifully, especially when she had the two facing off against each other, and then it all builds that really beautiful. Um, that really beautiful kind of climax where you have a self-actualized hologram Janeway soliciting the real Janeway, or at least her mind, and how best to get out of the mess of a situation they find themselves in the climax of the series of the season. So yeah, it was a really interesting challenge for her, but especially for us as writers to make sure we kept all that in our heads.
I think a great thing that you guys added into the show was the Janeway with the coffee, the hologram Janeway drinking the coffee. Whose
Yes.
idea was that to add that little detail?
I think it was one of those spontaneous things that as soon as somebody said it, and I honestly don't remember who said it, but everybody in the room was like, "Well, of course she does," and I very quickly it then spun off with some of the nerdier people in the writers' room. Was like, "Well, why is she drinking holographic coffee?" And I think very quickly one of us, maybe me, I don't remember, said, well, the way holo programs work is usually there is a personality matrix. And wouldn't it be funny if, as they were sort of scanning the original Janeway, they found if you took away the coffee, the whole holo program would dematerialize, decompile. It just couldn't work without her, with her holo coffee. And everybody seemed to love that idea. So, of course, and then it became sort of a staple, and everyone loved it.
And you're also the writer of one of my favorite episodes, not only of all Star Trek, but definitely the series, but all one of my favorites of all Star Trek, the Kobayashi episode,
Mhm.
where you brought back a lot of the classic characters. Spock came back, Mr. Scott appears, others. Um, what was the conversation like about that? How did you write the show to make sure that the voice actors, you had dialogue from other series to borrow from? Can you kind of talk me through how that all was set up?
I mean, it kind of came about organically because we started from a character perspective of let's put Dal through the Kobayashi Maru, to help break him down as a cocksure wannabe captain and make him realize that there are consequences to his actions and he should listen to his crew, which is kind of the purpose of it, really, besides just understanding what it means to fail, right? And dealing with that from an emotional standpoint. And so it started from that. And then as we got into the open question of like, well, what would a holodeck simulation of this Starfleet Academy program look like? Because canonically, we had only seen what it looked like 115 years prior or what have you, which was, if you recall from Wrath of Khan, literally a bunch of celebrated Starfleet heroes pretending to die on a simulated deck and then picking themselves up and saying, brushing themselves off and saying, "You failed, cadet," which we were like, surely in the age of the holodeck, they would update this. But for whatever reason, having like the best of a bridge crew felt like it was part of the program. And you have Spock as your number one, and then you have the cadet in the captain's chair. So we're like, well, what would that look like in the age of the holodeck? And of course, we realized, oh, there would be probably parameters in which you could maybe that would become part of it. Is like as the cadet is being tested as part of it, like he's given the impression that he can pick out the best bridge crew, and that's part of his captainhood. Anyway, and then of course that devolved into a writer's room argument of who's the best bridge crew, and then we spent hours and hours debating that and came to no conclusions whatsoever because every single Star Trek has amazing characters that all work together in different ways. So ultimately it kind of like fell in my lap of like, well, just try to do something with this. And we did talk like, do we want to recast people? Do we want to just go with who's available? And then I think we decided because this was, you have to remember, this was before Strange New Worlds and whatnot. We were like, wouldn't it be great just to find a way to use Leonard Nimoy's original performances? Because in the script as we broke it, the points he was making were ones that were straight from other shows anyway. So we were like, what if we found a way to do that? And then as the breaking of it went on, we were like, well, if we're including other characters, what if as an experiment we tried to preserve their performances as well? And we reached out to a lot of people, and Gates McFadden obviously said yes, thankfully. We did reach out to Rene Auberjonois, but then he unfortunately passed away before we could record him, and so then we realized that, do we just write him out of it now? That didn't really feel right to me, and so I decided, along with the Hagemans, to just put in the sweat equity and see if we could find a way to use Renee's performances as well as Odo. And then we went out to Nichelle Nichols, and she was unfortunately too sick to record, but she said if her estate said, if you can use her original performances, we would love that. And so it all just kind of went from there. And it all told, I think I read something like 80 Star Trek scripts from across Star Trek, rewatched top to bottom about 30 or 40 episodes, just trying to find those exact takes that could actually fit together. I started to lose my mind a little bit, but ultimately it was worth it. And the fact that it was a holo program, kind of made it okay in my mind of the, that they because it makes sense that ships would have logs and record what people said, and it might borrow from that. And it only seems to have become more relevant today in the age of Chat GTP or whatever.
And I think another great thing for Prodigy is that it has found new life on Netflix. So,
Yes.
what is it about the move to Netflix do you think that has now like reignited the interest in the series?
Well, I think it's. I'm not really talking out of school when I say that Netflix just has a tremendous reach. Like it's bigger than any other platform out there, and there are so many people that just never had a chance to see it before. And on top of that, I think people wanted to support the show, and helps get the word out. And sure enough, I've seen it popping up on top 10 kids lists around the globe. I think it achieved that on like in 15 different countries or something like that. And it does seem to have really lit a fire, and it feels like it's finally finding the audience that we always knew it could. So for that reason, I'm extremely grateful for everybody who fought for the show, and for CBS and everyone who went out of their way and Alex Kurtzman, who all said, this is a great show. Let's find a home for it that will find the viewers that we wanted to, and it seems to have done that.
And now that's been so popular on Netflix, there's obviously discussion from season two. Is there any updates you can give the audience and your listeners about where we are with season two happening?
Yeah, so season 2 is done. We have 20 episodes that are coming later this year. We finished mixing them and animating them, and the writing for them was done quite a while ago. So, stay tuned from Netflix for details on when season 2 will drop. But, we're very excited for people to see those. And, if it does well, the sky's the limit. Who knows? We may get more.
That is awesome. Aaron, thank you so much for coming on the show. You're an absolute pleasure. And like I said, great job with Star Trek Prodigy. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was really fun chatting with you. Thanks for having me.
Have a good night.
You too.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Traversing the Stars podcast. Please help me battle the algorithms by liking and subscribing. Be sure to return for the next exciting episode when Declan Shalvey boards the mothership. He's the writer of Thundercats and Alien. Till next voyage, travel on.